5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome to the Hughes College of Engineering. I'm Alex Barzilov. I'm a nuclear engineering faculty. We are happy to be co-hosting this event today, nuclear-related event, and thrilled to have the esteemed panel of experts here. Thank you all for coming out tonight to be a part of this event. Tonight's topic, 21st century global nuclear challenges, is important and timely. Please welcome. I would like to introduce Mr. Nelson Cochrane, Vice Chairman of Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation.
Thank you, Dr. Barzilov. Thank you all for coming tonight. On behalf of the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation, I would like to welcome you to this event. I think we're going to have a very interesting evening listening to these gentlemen impart some of their knowledge. This is one of those things when we were planning this event and talking about it and getting things put together, we kept saying to each other, I don't know, how do we get these three gentlemen to come to the same place and the same time together to give talks like this? I think we're going to be leaving here tonight with a lot of things to think about. I would like to recognize a few organizations and people who've made this happen. First is UNLV, the College of Engineering, which Dr. Barzilov represents. But in particular, I would like to thank the Dean of the college, Rama. I just went blank. Ben Cat, and also Molly Marks. Molly guided us through the mysteries of the universe and getting this thing to happen. The second is the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation for, again, supporting this event. In particular, our chairman, Troy Wade, who is here tonight, and our education lead trustee, Mary Pike, who got us connected up with UNLV. I'd also like to thank the Atomic Testing Museum Executive Director, Michael Hall. He joined us in December and landed right in the middle of this goings-on. He's still with us, which is good news. He and his staff have put in many, many hours on this and making this come together and getting all the details worked out. Kathy Powell, who is our marketing director, led that charge for the museum. Thank you, Kathy. Finally, I would like to make a special thank you to the Foundation's president, Linda Smith. Linda took charge of this. She was in the lead from the start. She never wavered. And believe me, we would not have been here tonight with these distinguished gentlemen without her drive to completion on this. Thank you, Linda. So let me say a few words about the moderator, Jack Dukowski. Jack and I have been associated with each other for many more years than either one of us will admit. However, we were very pleased to have him come. When we were looking for moderators and trying to think about who would be that person, when his name came up, people who knew him said, "You don't have to look anymore. Jack will be perfect for this." He is the founding principal partner with Innovative Technologies Partnership, LLC, which is located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They support the Department of Energy and National Nuclear Security Administration, national labs, and other federal agencies in a wide range of issues and studies involving national security. He specializes and leads facilitating ITP's scenario and strategic planning activities. He's also chairman of the Strategic Planning Committee for the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management. As that doesn't have enough to do, then he's also on several nonprofits, boards in the community there, and spends a lot of time helping them out. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Chowsky to the stage, and also our three presenters, and Jack will introduce them. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Let's get a little bit of feedback here. I told Nelson that was kind. I was kind of afraid if he was going to tell test site stories about me, and then I'd have to deny them all. Well, welcome. I could ask everybody to silence their phones. You probably all know to do that, but pretend you're in church, I guess. I'd like to welcome you in what I think will prove to be a very thought-provoking evening with our speakers today. We tested that out earlier, and all of us were short. Paul, if you want to sit over on this chair, then work out a little bit better.
Just turn it off.
This is the projector. Yeah, we could probably shut off that introduction material. Thanks for noticing that. All insanity. Our three guests tonight each have over 4 decades of experience and knowledge in helping to shape the nation's nuclear security posture. That, and I'm being a little bit generous with that so they don't feel too aged. That means we have more than 120 years of experience and knowledge on the stage, and please don't count how long I've been around, which would make the number too high to even imagine. You all have bios in your program on these three gentlemen, and there's a thing called Google and a thing called Wikipedia that can give you much more background than I'd be able to share with you tonight. I'd like to just add the fact that Dr. Robinson usually goes by ambassador because of the role that he played in many of the treaty negotiations going all the way back to the Ronald Reagan administration. SIG, not in his bio here, is also one of the world's leading experts in plutonium metallurgy, or was at one time. He probably doesn't practice that much anymore, more for ES&H reasons than for academic reasons. And Dr. Kukak is with us tonight and is the real pragmatist on the panel, and will share with us at the end of the evening some inward looks at the nuclear security enterprise and where we are today. So you can check out their bios online and in the program. For tonight's format, we've asked each of the presenters to talk for about 20 minutes on this subject, 21st century global nuclear challenges. And we have a specific order here that we're going to have them talk. Ambassador Robinson will give us a very big, high-level picture of the environment in the nuclear world, going back a few years and going forward. Dr. Hecker who has become very well known in the past several years for his academic work and actual physical interfaces with the North Koreans, will give us a special, sharp perspective that many of you may not have seen before of North Korea and the unique critical uncertainty within the nuclear challenges we all face today of that one particular country and the things that they're doing. And then to wrap this up, Dr. Kutkuk is going to take an inward look at the nuclear security enterprise and share with us some of his ideas and thoughts. After all three are done, we'll open up the questions and answers to the audience. We'll have 2 roving microphones, and we'll ask you to raise your hand if you have a question, and someone will come to you with a microphone. We hope to have that for about the last half hour of this evening so that we have time for everybody to ask questions. Well, as I mentioned, these gentlemen have more than 4 decades of experience. When you look back 2 decades into the latter part of the 20th century, the 1990s, who would have ever dreamed that we would be where we're at today? Well, I have personal knowledge and experience that these individuals were looking at where we would be today back then and speculating on the various paths to the future. I don't know if any of them wanted to think about where we would be today, but this is where we're at, and that's what we'll hear about tonight. So we'll ask you all to fasten your seatbelts as they do at Disneyland, and suspend your current beliefs and thinking about where we are and what we're doing and what the threats are and where we might be going. And let your imaginations run a little bit tonight as you listen to these folks. 1996, 1997 was a period of great changes. It was the end of the Cold War. We were no longer testing nukes. We were embarking on stockpile stewardship, a brand new program of great science and great computational capabilities. And we were looking at the reshaping of the nuclear weapons complex. It was the dot-com boom. And believe it or not, we had budget surpluses here in the U.S. There was an awful lot to be optimistic about. Back in that time frame, Peter Schwartz, Dr. Peter Schwartz, who is one of the world's leading scenario planners and had a company called Global Business Network, in fact, was so optimistic about the future in 1997 that he did something that he told his clients never to do. He wrote a single scenario about the future, a path to the future, and it was called A Long Boom. It was in Wired magazine, and you can still get it online. A History of the Future, 1980 to 2020. And even though he wrote a cautionary statement that I shouldn't be doing this, I'm just so optimistic. And here's what he said: we're facing 25 years of prosperity, freedom, and a better environment for the whole world. You got a problem with that? And he talks in his article about a lot of things that actually happened. Technology changes, the rise in Asia. He does speak about the concern of fundamentalism and its impact on all of these events, but doesn't talk much about it. These days, Peter still is worried that he did this because it was a one path to the future that obviously demonstrated what he teaches his clients not to do. And that is, you can't think that way. You have to think about the other options that might exist, rehearse those options, what are the events that will take you to those worlds, and monitor them. And when you're doing that, have the discussions that say, as a national laboratory, what might we do to make that change in the future path if it's heading in a direction we don't want it to go. And that's what we'll ask you to do tonight, is to listen to the things that these folks have to say and think about what other paths to the future might exist, or if we're heading down one, what might we do, even as individuals, to make a change? Peter Schwartz did this in 1991 with South Africa. He wrote a set of scenarios called the Mountain Floor Scenarios to help the South African people understand that if they did away with apartheid, the world wasn't going to come to an end. And they published 1 million copies of that set of scenarios around the country. And it actually helped the South African government convince the population that this could happen and it wasn't the end of the world. I think he was trying to do the same thing with his article on the long boom, was to convince the world that there was an optimistic future. Even back in that time frame, there were dark clouds hanging on the horizon. In scenarios that I developed with Peter Schwartz and GDN for Honeywell FM&T, we identified future worlds that were called Prepare for the Terrorists, and one called The Dominoes Falling, which at the time I asked Dr. Hecker if I could use that term because he used it in some of his talks about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And indeed, we're seeing some of that happen today, as he'll talk about with just the one example of North Korea. When I did my first set of scenarios with Honeywell FM&T, I had the management team and we developed a set of future-looking worlds, and we were tracking indicators. And in the early part of 1998, February-March timeframe, I made a presentation to the management team and I said, these are all the indicators that are pointing to the possibility of India testing nuclear weapons sometime this year. And as we've talked about, Pakistan will follow shortly after that. And everybody kind of jacks at it again. And from the back of the room, I heard, well, that will never happen. And that hit me kind of hard because we were just talking about facts. But that stuck in my mind, so I made a note of it. And it turns out that as I've done scenario planning with labs and DOE entities and others around the world in the past 15 years, virtually every event, every scenario planning event, at some point in time when we talk about improbable futures, someone in the room will say, well, that will never happen. And I always make note of that because that will stimulate the strategic discussions that are necessary to be prepared for any event. The most recent example I have of that is kind of strange. I was in Washington, D.C. at a big NSF conference, late evening, with some very high-level lawyers from D.C. who were talking about the continuing resolution and the budgets and how NSF was going to get funded under different scenarios. But there was no mention of, who. And so when there was a lull in the conversation, I just kind of casually said, well, that will probably all change when Trump is president. And everybody looked at me and they almost dropped their glasses. And this one top lawyer looked at me and he said, that will never happen. And I just, sort of like an electric shock went up and down my body. And I said, oh, we'll see how all that plays out. After 9/11, I was called in by the Office of Secure Transportation, which runs the nuclear materials and weapons on the road, and they asked me to help them plan for the future in this different world. We talked in the 2001-2002 timeframe of the possibility of a war with Iraq, the formation of a new mega federal agency, new federal agency in a Republican administration called Department of Homeland Security, and that will never happen. So we've seen that come through as a theme. So tonight, for the next hour, what I'd like you to do is set aside your personal views and biases about the future. And when the speakers say something that triggers that little small voice in your head to say, well, that will never happen, make a mental note of that and think about it later. And ask yourself, well, what would it take for us to get there if that were to actually happen? And if we were there, what would we be doing? So let's all sit back now and relax a little bit. And we'll have Ambassador Robinson give us a big picture perspective of what's going on.
Well, let's see how this microphone works. Anybody that I'm speaking too loud at this point, can you hear it well enough? Good. Okay. Let me begin. Oh, is this one not working yet? Testing 1, 2? Okay. I have written down the comments as a paper, and if Linda wouldn't mind, if anybody should like to get a copy of it, you'll send her or give her your card with an email address, and I'll make sure I get one to you. There's a lot of material, so do fasten your seatbelts. I want to begin by talking about the basic question of when wars start and when they end. The Cold War, the subject of tonight's discussion, is probably the best case in point. When did the Cold War start? My best guess at an answer would be the 29th of August, 1949, which is the day when the Soviet Union ended America's 4-year monopoly as the only country with nuclear weapons. And when they detonated at a test site in Kazakhstan their first nuclear weapon. When the Cold War ended, however, is a much more difficult question. It's harder to assess because there were no proclamations, no parades, no speeches, and we don't have a national holiday celebrating the end of the Cold War. Isn't that strange? Well, many would guess that it ended in 1991, which is when the Soviet Union, the USSR, disintegrated as a country into many parts. Some of them who were back together as the Commonwealth of Independent States got together, but there are a lot that are seeking their own way as independent states. But many in the press at that time said, well, the Cold War is over and the U.S. won it. I never liked that. I thought, it's probably somewhat overblown. Whenever I was asked, my answer was, no, what I saw was the Soviet Union declared bankruptcy. And we're still watching the restructuring of that coming out. It's taken some interesting turns. As they got richer from oil monies, they indeed started to look a lot like the old Soviet Union in terms of their behaviors, at least in the Russian Federation. Let me make sure my sundial is working in here. Let's see, so I don't go too long. This is a question that certainly for 5 or 6 years has been coming more and more to the front. Are we going back to the old Cold War behaviors? And I'll highlight for you a few of the things that would indicate to me that, yeah, it looks like we are. Now, this is not to say that there were not some great things that happened during this period, and I'd like to highlight that the joint agreements by the U.S. and the USSR, and then later with the Russian Federation, are among the biggest highlights, and in particular, the most remarkable is that the SALT, START, and successor negotiations succeeded in bringing down the number of strategic nuclear weapons by 90%, 90%. The total on both sides that had been built was 130,000. Yeah, 130,000 nuclear weapons. And they reduced those by 90%, first giving a limit of 2,000 to 2,500 on each state, and then New Start, which actually we have until the end of 2018 to satisfy the conditions, brings each to a further limit of 1,550 warheads on 800 launchers as the condition. This amounts to another additional 30% reduction of these down to 10% they did before. And in a world of worrying about nuclear war, which I've spent, along with these gentlemen, my life worrying about, that's a remarkable development in any case, and one that I think gives us some history to be optimistic about the future. Now, there's a downside to that the Russians had always refused to allow tactical nuclear weapons to be included in any of the counts. And we never got an agreement with them on what exactly was tactical, and one of the problems were the yields of some of their tacticals exceeded their strategics. But nonetheless, they would call things tactical and say they are not to be counted. The past 8 years or so, as the familiar accompaniments of the Cold War begin to emerge, their behavior has changed. They first took over control of 2 territories in Georgia and planning to annex them. Similarly in the Crimea, formerly the Ukraine, with plans to annex both of those. One must wonder where they will next repeat these similar tactics of armed invasions masking as internal disturbances by the local Russian population when really the people who were fighting were Spetsnaz troops. Vladimir Putin now seems to be ratcheting up the threats against NATO nearly every day in the news, and seems to have targeted both the Baltic states and the former Warsaw Pact nations as possible other members he'd like to annex. His brandishing of threats to use nuclear weapons. Wasn't it refreshing not to hear about those for a while? But they're now back in the news saying if NATO opposes what they're trying to do, watch out, we would have the right to strike you with nuclear weapons. And since the Soviet Union got somewhat well financially, they've been improving and making a new generation of nuclear weapons. The recently brought into being 2 new types of land-based missiles, a low-flyer road and rail mobile strategic missile system capable of frustrating most of our existing missile defenses, and a new land-based missile that delivers its strategic warhead by means of a boost glide vehicle. It first goes out of the atmosphere, comes up, bounces off the atmosphere, and hugs the upper atmosphere, which makes it very hard for defensive systems. And then still moving at Mach 5, it dives into its target. The other really shocking development, besides new air-launched missiles and new air-launched cruise missiles, with 2 new submarines to carry each types of submarines to carry those, they have achieved a game changer in what they claim is a new generation of tactical battlefield weapons. They're based on pure fusion explosives. These are said to produce little radiation-induced radioactivity and not very much radioactive fallout, which would enable them to be used in close proximity to their own troops, to their own territory, and wouldn't require any keep-out zones after they were used before they could re-enter the lands. In the development of these, they said they were carried out in compliance with the comprehensive test ban. I'm not so sure. They must have been detonating weapons, but probably it yields well below a kiloton, maybe even lower in cavities in the ground or in what are called coblas, large physically built structures, which could hide those things from seismic detection. But in any case, they plan to do major builds of these, and I think it's something we don't have a counter for, and it is something anybody as a close neighbor to Russia needs to worry about today. The most worrisome all is something you may not have heard about unless you were keeping up over the past 6 weeks. That's the Russian Federation's disclosure, maybe by accident, maybe intentionally, revealed the development of a new type of nuclear weapon far more powerful than any previous type, called an autonomous drone submarine, but with a yield in many tens of megatons. Now, the way this is to be deployed is in shallow waters off the coast of either major cities, major submarine ports, military systems, our own civilian population centers. They would detonate these stealthily, place them there stealthily, detonate them, and create tsunamis of highly radioactive materials, including perhaps cobalt salting of these to bury all of those targets I just mentioned, which are very important to us in deadly radiation. The Pentagon has codenamed this program Canyon with a K. And the Russians call these submarines unmanned underwater vehicle devices. But they're a game changer and something new on the scenes that most of us are still trying to digest and figure out what it means and what to do about it. Now, there are also other nations we need to consider for plans in the future. The next most important is China. They've become one of the richest nations in the world, maybe second to the U.S., maybe beginning to surpass us. Now that they've become so rich, they've been really reinvesting in defense expenditures. They are building a test glide vehicle, which they just gave a demonstration of, as Russia did. And they're building new ballistic missiles, new launchers, nuclear submarines, cruise missile submarines, as well as new bombers and tactical fighter planes. Two of them, one of the fighters looks a whole lot like the US F-22, which is our best, and the other looks a lot like the F-35, which is a nuclear-capable tactical aircraft. Chinese, unfortunately, during the past month, even appear to be copying Russia's pattern of harassments of U.S. boats and airplanes, this time operating in the China Sea instead of the Russians doing it in the Baltic. In earlier press reports, and a particular bothersome one I've used in several talks and worry about a lot, China appears to have completed about 3,000 miles of high-quality superhighway completely underground for rail mobile and road mobile missiles. Now that would give us a terrible time. How do you target what is moved and you never know where it is at the time you're targeting it? It would be impossible, as things stand now, for us to hold such targets at risk. Now, other than these new two advances from the largest nation in territory, Russian Federation, and the largest in population, China, there's one other, and I'm going to leave that to Sig Hecker, North Korea. And I am pleased to give you the optimistic view, and I try to be an optimist, that of all the nuclear threats we face, those are the really only three to worry about. And the reason why is Iran is just getting started. They're on the cusp and not yet nuclear, though they've been trying for a number of years. And a number of states have developed nuclear weapons, but I'm pleased to say the rest of them are U.S. allies. Pakistani may not be as good an ally as we would like, but certainly Israel, India are, and there are two interesting reports that two other nations did develop nuclear weapons, but then decided to give them up. The first one of these being South Africa, which there was a report in the last few months that instead of dismantling them all, they're partially dismantled and in storage in a diamond mine underground in Africa, which I found most interesting. But the other nuclear states are fortunately our allies, and you may not know this, but the U.S. in its policy has allowed 30 other nations, independent nations, to be under our nuclear umbrella and protection, which gives us lots of friends in the world for doing other things together, and we need to keep on building of the number of friends. You can never have too many friends. Now, ever since 1945, the U.S. has had a stockpile of nuclear weapons, and we've all spent a lot of time developing policies and trying to make those policies adaptable to the changes we're seeing elsewhere in the world. The U.S. has put the most constraints on itself about the use of nuclear weapons. We used our nuclear weapons and our deterrent plan only as a retaliatory response. Never as a first strike, but only as a second strike. And even in the most serious and life-threatening situations, we elect not to ever shoot first. The U.S. has never embraced, and you hear this in the press, that, well, we had a first strike policy. Absolutely not. We have never had a first strike policy, nor has it ever authorized a launch on warning. That's never been a part. There totally false misconceptions about our nuclear policy. The U.S. maintains an arsenal of nuclear weapons for one purpose only, and that purpose is to prevent war. One school of thought that builds off that was put forward by Ronald Reagan, and he was notable of anyone I've ever known for uncommon common sense. He said, a nuclear war would be so awful that no one could ever win it. More likely, whoever was in it could probably lose everything. So our deterrence is really about assuring that there's some forethought on the part of anyone attempting aggression against the U.S. or other free nations of the world. And we want it to be sufficient to convince them from ever starting a nuclear war in the first place. Why on earth would anyone start one if you were likely to lose everything? And that's why we continue to keep and maintain our deterrent. The deterrence has been in place ever since the use of the first weapons, August 6th and August 9th in 1945 to bring World War II to an end. And President Reagan, I think, has given the most eloquent short statement, and let me close with that. In his March 23rd, 1983 televised statement to the nation on our defense policy, he said, "The defense policy of the United States is based on a single premise. The United States does not start wars. We will never be an aggressor. We maintain our strength in order to deter and defend against aggression in order to preserve peace and freedom." And I believe that's why we're all here, and I've certainly devoted my career to it. I appreciate your attention tonight, and I look forward to more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sig Hecker, and as Ambassador Robinson mentioned, he's going to talk about one of the specific critical uncertainties that we face today by giving us an inside look at North Korea. Those of us that live in New Mexico are just love Sig because he comes up every January to Los Alamos and tells us what he's done in the past year. And all of the things you'll hear tonight in a condensed version, more than likely is available on YouTube somewhere.
Thank you, Jack. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to allow my colleagues to either go sideways or off the stage. So as Jack pointed out, I do talk in Los Alamos in January for a public lecture. It's the only other place that I know that you can get this many people at night to come and listen to nuclear stuff. So this is a very special community, and I particularly thank the Atomic Testing Museum for putting on such a wonderful program. So, as said, I'm going to talk specifically. I should say, though, in addition to talking to people like Los Alamos and public lectures, I teach out at Stanford these days, the last 11 years, and so I have a different kind of audience out there. Okay, so however, before talking about North Korea, I want to set the stage. I'm not going to give you the big tour that Paul Robinson just did, but I do want to give you my perspective of what the nuclear challenges look like today, because to me they are different than the Cold War. And that is, I like to divide them into these three categories. A massive nuclear exchange that could end life as we know it. Let's say 100 weapons. Regional war. Let's say, roughly 10 weapons. Or a terrorist attack, where we might be talking about 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. And let me put some details in this. The only way we can have a massive exchange today is really U.S.-Russia. Chinese don't have enough weapons yet that they can deliver for such a massive exchange. Besides, I wouldn't expect one. But in U.S.-Russia, of course, this was the concern during the Cold War, even though, as Paul Robinson just told you, things have turned quite sour again between U.S. and Russia. Nevertheless, I don't think we'll be returning to a Cold War and to a massive exchange. I just came back from Russia a week ago for my 52nd trip to Russia since 1992. And I worked the issues that I'm concerned about with the Russian, and that is to make sure that none of their nuclear assets or our nuclear assets actually get out of the government's control. On the long run, and if you really look and if you understand Russia, there's just absolutely no reason for us to be enemies. The issues are mostly domestic issues. The Russians now have domestic issues, just like we have our domestic issues. And by the way, guess how can I answer when they say, hey, what about your presidential race? So we don't necessarily have it all together either. The regional nuclear war concern Without question, my biggest concern is South Asia, and that's India and Pakistan. And the possibility that between those two nations you could actually have things go wrong where you could have an exchange of nuclear weapons. They both have possibly around 100 or so nuclear weapons, and so we can't rule that out. The next is Northeast Asia. That's what I'm going to cover today in some detail. There's also the possibility of some sort of struggle with China, with Taiwan, South China Sea. Again, I consider that unlikely but possible. Middle East, we have great concerns about Iran, and as Paul Robinson pointed out, for the time being, at least, the Iran timeline has been pushed back quite a while. In my opinion, a very important agreement. I won't touch on it anymore tonight unless I get questions. The one that I'm actually really concerned about, and I won't talk about tonight, is the potential of a terrorist attack. And that is that terrorists could possibly get a hold of fissile materials, build an improvised nuclear device, and find some way to deliver that. And it isn't going to matter much whether it's Moscow or Washington or Paris. That's going to change the world in a significant way. Okay, so let's talk about North Korea. They've certainly been in the news. The young leader, Kim Jong-un, has threatened to nuke the U.S., South Korea. But the question is, can he actually do it? So let me ask the audience, just to get a sense. You're here in an atomic city. So what's the answer to that question? Can Kim Jong-un in North Korea nuke the United States today? No. Let's see a show of hands of those of you who think he can nuke the United States. Today. Okay, just 1, 2, or 3, maybe 4. How many of you think he wants to nuke the United States? More than half of the hands. Okay. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Just a little bit of background in terms of North Korea. How in the world did this country actually get nuclear weapons? They're supposed to be so backwards, the last Stalinist state, the hermit kingdom and all of that. Well, it turns out they, just like the South Korean, have a lot of smart industrial people. They, instead of taking care of their own people and building things like Samsung and Hyundais and others, they decided to go in the other direction, and build nuclear weapons over time. It's been on and off for 50 years, not a steady march, but on and off for 50 years. These are the three Kims, and that essentially they have this autocratic hierarchy, the grandfather, the father, and the son. The program started back already in the 50s, and by the 1960s, the Soviets built a research reactor for the North Koreans. Just the same as we did for Tehran in Iran, because they were our buddies. So they were both recipients of Atoms for Peace, people trained. The Iranians here, the North Koreans in the Soviet Union. They then went their own direction, built an indigenous reactor program, and built what I would call the option for the bomb. This is something similar to what Iran did. Not build the bomb, but sort of put all the pieces in place. In the case of North Korea, it was to build a reactor, build a reprocessing facility to go to plutonium route to the bomb. And that was pretty much ready to go in the early 1990s, but then their world fell apart because the Soviet Union fell apart. And so by 1994, just before the great leader, the grandfather, died, he actually came to an accommodation with the United States that was called the Agreed Framework with the Clinton administration. And what he said, he would agree to freeze their nuclear program that was nuclear weapons oriented in return for help from the United States to build light water, modern reactors, and to end the U.S.'s hostility towards North Korea, as he called it. It turns out that lasted sort of off and on. They didn't do all the things they said they were going to do. We didn't do all the things we said we were going to do. But it lasted during the Clinton administration. But then the Bush administration came in, and they had a very different view of dealing with the North Koreans. Actually, there were the words of the vice president, and he said, we don't deal with evil, we destroy it. And indeed, in 2002, the U.S. walked away from this agreed framework because they accused the North Koreans of cheating with the uranium route to the bomb. Well, it turns out they were cheating, and they were developing uranium enrichment capabilities at the time. However, the decision made, in my opinion, looking back at it, was a very unwise decision in that the agreed framework was essentially done away with. North Korea walked away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, reprocessed the plutonium they'd held up in a spent fuel plant for 8 years, and built a bomb. 2003. And nothing happened. George W. Bush administration had said they will never allow North Korea to get the bomb. North Koreans got the bomb. But as you know, we were occupied other places in 2003, and so the North Koreans got the bomb. However, Kim Il-sung had died back in 1994. His son, the dear leader, Kim Jong-il, they built the bomb. Then they signed the denuclearization agreement. They said once again they would actually denuclearize the Korean Peninsula in return for appropriate compensations. And again, for sort of the stoppage of hostility. Because I'm sure, as you all know, the Korean War, was never settled. It's just through an armistice and not a peace treaty. However, even after they signed it, again, there were problems on the American side, problems on the North Korean side, and finally they went ahead and they tested a bomb in 2006. It didn't work so well. They tested another one in 2009. That one worked just fine. And then in 2011, in December, the dear leader died, and his son, who was basically unknown, 28, we believe at the time, took over. And he went pretty much full speed ahead. They finally had a successful space launch. They did the third and fourth nuclear tests, the last one just this January. And they actually wrote nuclear weapons into their constitution, saying that they are a nuclear weapons state. Okay, so how do we know anything about North Korea? Because I'm going to give you sort of the bottom line of what our best assessment is. Well, we've got overhead imagery. This is just a collection of collages of the things that you can get from commercial satellite. This is the construction of a new experimental light water reactor. But as you know, the satellites can only see certain things, so you'd like to see inside. Well, strangely enough, I've been inside of the North Korean nuclear complex. I've been there 7 times. I've been to their nuclear complex 4 times. This, for those of you, many of you will recognize this plutonium glove box. And I love plutonium. That is the most enigmatic, complex element in the whole wide world. And so I had plutonium metallurgy discussion with these North Koreans. They were pretty good at it also, I must say. So, for whatever reason that they gave me access, we were able to make a good assessment of their plutonium capabilities. So I went there 7 times, and each of those first 6, every year from 2004 on, each of those first 6 visits we learned a lot from the North Koreans. So we were able to make a pretty good assessment. And then the 7th visit was really mind-boggling, and that is, they had denied for all these years having a uranium enrichment program, and then they showed me this modern facility in a building I had been in just 2 years prior. So it was clear that they had built something someplace else. They went ahead and duplicated it here. So now they were signaling they had the second path to the bomb, not only plutonium, but also highly enriched uranium. Very strange thing, they use the web. And particularly through the KCNA, Korea Central News Agency, they post these kind of photos of the young leader going out into the nuclear places. This is a flow-forming machine, which is central to being able to make marging steel rotors. And they show those. So, let me then give you an assessment. So in 2003, as I mentioned, when they walked away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, sort of helped along by the Bush administration accusations. Essentially everything was there sort of in limbo. The reactors, they actually had 3 at one point that they were constructing, 2 big ones. They never finished those. The other one was in standby. Fuel fab was corroding. Uranium enrichment, they denied it, although they sold uranium hexafluoride to Libya. And then we indeed accused them. They were building a reactor for Syria that we didn't know about until the Israelis destroyed it in 2007. And they didn't say anything about nuclear weapons in 2003 because they said this wasn't for nuclear weapons purposes. Their nuclear complex was for civilian. So, as I said, plutonium production halted, uranium enrichment, they were building the capacity covertly, no weapons, I believe no successful long-range rockets. And so here's the bad news story as to what's happened now. And I'll show you it's happened over both the Bush and the Obama administration. Is if we look at the end of this year, and again, all we can do is give estimates. Plutonium, I think, quite good. Uranium, we're not sure. So they've got plutonium, maybe enough for 6 to 8 bombs, but now they have enough uranium that maybe they can have 18 bombs. So they may have around 25 bombs by the end of this year. That changes the picture totally from when I was first there in 2003, 2004, 5, 6. They saw a handful of not very sophisticated, in my opinion. So now they've got that, and they have 4 nuclear tests spread out over 10 years. You can imagine how you can learn from one test to the next. So they've gone from maybe having a nuclear device that's like a terrorist device to having an arsenal, or at least that's my view. And then by 2020, you know, things look much worse because with highly enriched uranium, the best estimates that we can make is perhaps they have enough to make 6 bombs worth a year today. So there was this test in January 2006, and they announced that they've not only tested it, but they tested a hydrogen bomb. And then a couple of months later, they actually showed again the young leader out with the troops, apparently looking at this hydrogen bomb. Well, for those of you who know much about bombs, it doesn't look exactly like a hydrogen bomb to me. But they've got something, and he's here with missiles, he's here with reentry vehicles, and then they actually had a video, and we did a frame grab of that video, and that's why it's so fuzzy, but those of you who know bombs, you know, the reentry vehicle, with something inside of it that's small enough to fit in the reentry vehicle. So the message is, look, you know, all those years we now have bombs, we may have a lot of bombs, and we've miniaturized these things to be able to put them inside a reentry vehicle. So the bottom line is, how dangerous is all of this? Well, I actually believe he can't nuke the United States. He can't do it today. Will he have that capability, you know, in 5 to 10 years? Maybe. They have, you know, they've launched a satellite, but it takes a lot more than the launch into space. It has to come back down to re-enter. They've shown some capabilities there, but for the most part, that's still beyond their reach. Many of their missiles, most of their missiles still, the long-range missiles, blow up when they shoot them off. But it's not good to have a nuclear warhead on a missile that blows up, you know, in your own soil. So I think they're still quite a ways away. However, clearly they want to get the message across that, look, we have the bomb and we can keep you at risk. And just since so many things today are so partisan, I just want to show you this terrible situation of having North Korea develop a whole nuclear arsenal. There's enough blame to go around, as they say. You know, you can start with Reagan, they were laying the foundation. During George H.W., they were getting ready. They got ready. During Clinton, they were fully ready, but they stepped back for a while. Bush challenged them, they broke up. And Obama, during his term, full speed ahead. They've built the arsenal. You know, how much did they have in terms of nuclear weapons? Well, probably nothing in the first 3, but then 6 by the time Bush administration went out, is my best guess, and then probably 20 or so by the time Obama goes out. I show this in China sometimes, and they laugh because the American presidents were unsuccessful. Well, I show their Chinese presidents were just as unsuccessful. So this isn't just a failure of American diplomacy, it's an international failure. This country has done it, you know, under our noses. So what do we do? Well, I'm not sure. The one thing that's clear to me, when I've been advising our government for the last 6 to 7 years, is at least don't let it get worse. These guys are not going to give up their nuclear weapons now, so at least stop it from getting worse. So I coined this 3 no's. No more bombs, no better bombs, no export. And in return, actually take a look at their security concerns. They are worried. They can't destroy the United States of America. We can destroy North Korea. So they have security concerns. And then certainly their people need energy, they need assistance. So, however, this sort of thing will take patience. We had a couple of attempts and neither country has done terribly well. So this is going to be, you know, near the top of the list of the next president. So now I'm going to take you really quickly, because my time's going to be up in about 2 minutes, through some photos, just to show you what North Korea looks like. What we see in the news today is mostly this: goose-stepping soldiers, terrible death camps, all of these things. It turns out it's true. This is a terrible regime. They've deprived their people, since that country was created and Korea was divided. However, these are my photos. I went to various, children musicals, to theaters, to schools, out to the farms. These are real people. We tend to demonize the government, but we shouldn't demonize the people. Look at the kids. Look at the students. In the upper right hand, I'm there next to a young lady in the Korean school. She was writing an essay on Thomas Alva Edison. That's North Korea. I was in their language school. They were learning about Mozart. I have a video of two debating each other in American English in North Korea. I went to a concert. Talented people. Don't wait for the North to collapse. That's actually part, at least what some think is part of Obama administration's strategic patience of sort of waiting them out. That's the new airport. Looks pretty fancy. Went around, they say there are no cars in North Korea. Here's a taxi. You look very closely, it's a Ford Focus. Okay, on the streets of Pyongyang, that's my photo. Then there's this hotel that they finished after 20 years or so. Pretty impressive looking place. This one went up within the last few years. Another hotel in Pyongyang that a friend of mine who still goes there, they haven't allowed me to come back since 2010. Sanctions, I'm not sure how effective, but I'd like to go to the ski area. So they've set up the ski area in quite a chalet, as you can see. But, time is not on their side, because the only way they've been able to control those people is to repress them, make sure they can't get outside information. When I was there, I took these pictures of people with cell phones. Today, there are 3 million cell phones in North Korea. They're at least talking to each other. They're restricted, but they're talking. And that, in the end, will help to change that place. In the meantime, we just have to make sure they don't blow it up. So, let me end with this, because every now and then you have your camera ready. This time I didn't have my camera ready, but I got it out really quickly, because there was something that was so unusual in the subway as I was coming out of North Korea. And it was a young kid. And you'll see, he's wearing sort of a beige jacket and the red bandana. That's the obligatory thing. But if you can see it on his head, there's a baseball cap. Probably can't see it too well. It's a baseball cap. He's wearing it backwards with a Nike swoosh. This is Pyongyang. So let me end with this. With a swoosh, there has to be some hope.
Thank you, Dr. Hecker. One of the questions I ask when I do a scenario planning exercise of senior management in interviewing them is, what keeps you awake at night? And certainly there's some elements of that keeps us awake, but I'm glad you ended on a happy note. And now our last speaker is Dr. Kukak. And Bob is the pragmatist of the group, and he's going to sort of take an inward look at the nuclear enterprise and encapsulate some of the things that have been said. Bob?
Yeah, that's the first time I've heard Sig give that talk, and I'd rather hear him talk 21 minutes himself. That's pretty fascinating, Sig. By the way, what Sig didn't tell you, or what I think was said about Sig, is he goes down to northern New Mexico every January and tells them what he's working on. I think what he really does is go down to northern New Mexico in January in the middle of winter, tell them how nice it is to live in California. Anyway, let's see. I've tried to do real-time editing here to kind of fit in around which mic am I using? Is it this one? Are you hearing me now? Are you hearing me now? Okay, this one is the one I'm using. Okay, thanks, good. Okay, let me, this topic about 21st century nuclear challenges, when I first heard about it, I thought, wow, that's incredibly broad, that's incredibly complex. What a challenge. I thought of it for a moment. When I saw the three speakers that were chosen, I knew this is really about nuclear weapons. But I was thinking, what would have happened 100 years ago on May 25th in 1916 if you asked someone, or three people, to speculate about what the challenges are for that century. And they were mired in the middle of World War I, the war to end all wars. Can you imagine how wrong their estimates probably would have been? It was stunning to think that we can look at these challenges with enough foresight to know what we do, what we should do. And so I found myself very comfortably then looking at, well, then we have to prepare to find out what to do and do what we have to do when we have to do it. In other words, we have to build capability. We have to have a policy. If we're going to stick with a policy of deterrence, then we have to have a deterrent, and that deterrent has to be viable, it has to be responsive, it has to be cutting edge, it has to be innovative, it has to be active and visible to everybody, to them, to us, to all of our allies. And so it seems to me that's how we need to go forward and face these challenges that we're suddenly seeing come at us. And we're seeing them, as you've heard from them, we're seeing not only old Cold War-like buildups of nuclear stuff, we're seeing new technologies and capabilities coming in new air defenses being placed around Moscow and other places in Russia, deeply buried targets which aren't necessarily high-tech or new, but we're seeing things that now become a threat to the effectiveness of our retaliatory attack. We're seeing an offensive threat, we're seeing a threat to our own credible return. We're seeing a whole different flavor of mixing conventional hostilities with nuclear. We've always had a very clear psychological barrier, I think, between conventional warfare and conflict and nuclear conflict, and we're seeing a blurring of that, I think, now. One of the first things we're seeing is that our nuclear deterrent is not deterring a lot of things associated with nuclear that are happening. A lot of little green men running around Crimea with someone behind them holding a nuclear weapon, and now even openly beginning to threaten us with those nuclear weapons. We see China and Russia to Crimea, Russia, Georgia. We're seeing China moving to the South Sea. These are all hostilities, aggressive behaviors happening under the threshold of our nuclear deterrent. The important thing about our nuclear deterrent, Paul was pointing out how great it is to have 30 countries on our side, and I agree with that 100%. Having 30 countries, or whatever the exact number is, that we've committed to their defense with our nuclear deterrent really changes the character of some of these challenges that we keep seeing come forward. People are starting to ask questions, you know. Number one, is our Cold War deterrent still credible in today's world with all these changes? Do we still have confidence in the stockpile 20 years into this moratorium era? If we do have confidence in that stockpile, is it the right stockpile? If necessary, could we reconfigure that stockpile to make it the right stockpile? And there's a lot of questions about that, both politically and technically. And I'll get to that in a minute when I talk about the technical underpinning of our credibility. What would be the threshold that our president would use a nuclear weapon? Paul's absolutely right. The fundamental purpose of nuclear weapons in America is to deter a nuclear attack. But there's an awful lot of other things we've done now with respect to that nuclear deterrent, and that is tie it to allied securities that are being threatened in different ways. And a big challenge, of course, as I mentioned, is how are we going to deal with this blurring of conventional and nuclear? I have taken the approach, let's see if I can get my notes in order here, because I've kind of jumped around based on their talks and so forth. I've chosen to put my comments tonight under three major challenges. I made them up. I mean, I'm calling them the major challenges. It's just a way for me to convey to you my thoughts. And by the way, the thoughts that I'm giving you are mine, but in the sense of ownership, but they're certainly not mine in the sense of content. I've learned a lot from these guys and lots of other people who are working with the scientists at the laboratories, and so I'm really conveying to you my opinion and judgment of what I think is being felt by a lot of our weapons scientists, particularly in the laboratories. The first challenge I would say is we need to redefine and clarify the role of nuclear weapons in our national defense. I'll come back to all three of these in a minute. The second one is, after we've done that, do we, if necessary, reconfigure our nuclear stockpile so it aligns with what we think that role is going forward. And third, and most important in what I'm speaking about tonight in my mind, is to reestablish and reinvigorate our nuclear deterrent, including stockpile confidence, to be dynamically robust now and robust against future challenges. So let me talk about those in a little bit more detail. Let me think back when I started. Okay. Time's going fast. The very first one, let me just say a few words about redefining and clarifying the role of nuclear weapons. That's something that is a normal activity that's done every 5 to 10 years in the United States. It's called the Nuclear Posture Review. Every recent president has done that, 2010, 2001, 1994 by the three presidents. Purpose of that document is to address the purposes of nuclear weapons, how we would use them, and so forth. Right now, the fundamental purpose is to deter nuclear attacks. When Obama did this in 2010, there was a lot of pressure, a lot of debate of why are we saying fundamental, why aren't we saying that's the sole purpose? And we don't say it's the sole purpose, we say it's the fundamental purpose. And that has left flexibility to deal now with all these other issues that are coming forth. The issue of first use. China says they won't use first use. We won't say that. Russia's now said they're going to use first use. So things are changing. And so I expect early on with the next president, they will do the next nuclear posture review. I think it's going to be, the reason I'm calling it a major challenge is I think this posture review might be and should be and probably will be, first of all, I think it's a major challenge because of the necessity for it right now and the complexity of it. I would find it a much tougher nuclear posture review today than when we're still thinking just deterring a major nuclear power against us. And I think a big part of that problem is going to be dealing with extended deterrence, the commitments we've made to other countries. The second challenge that I said is to reconfigure, if necessary, our nuclear stockpile. That could flow from the nuclear posture review. It could happen independent of the nuclear posture review if crises continue to grow. The President and the Department of Defense certainly need congressional funding approvals, but they can change the character of our stockpile if they see a crisis and a need to do that. There are two major issues with it. First, I think it's probably going to be a more controversial thing by far to do than actually figure out the nuclear posture review, because we're actually physically starting to change weapons. I think that's going to bring a lot of ideological agendas in conflict with each other, arms reduction, non-proliferation, zero nuclear. I think there's a whole bunch of that. So I think looking at our stockpile in some context of today's threats and deciding if and how to change it is going to be a major policy undertaking. There's a second contribution to that, and that is the technical aspects that we haven't been testing for 25 years. We very much undermined the scientific R&D, scientific thinking that underpins this whole deterrent. And so what would we be capable of doing right now in order to change that stockpile, particularly without testing? And again, I would just say the kinds of questions that I hear out there around this stockpile thing are, the current stockpile already isn't deterring issues that are close to nuclear, so it already isn't the right stockpile in somebody's mind. Would the U.S. really launch an ICBM over some conventional attack against a NATO partner? Or would we choose instead to engage conventionally? Or would we have no response whatsoever, even though we have a treaty? Those questions are out there now. A great book on this that I really enjoy. I recommend to anybody that want to really get into all this stuff is a friend of all of ours, Brad Roberts, who spent his career in nuclear policy in the Department of Defense and just spent a year up with SIG and these guys at Stanford, and just wrote a book that came out last December making a case for 21st century nuclear weapons. These kinds of questions really are debated well in there. A rising concern is, should the president have more flexibility in response? We're beginning to hear now the blurring of nuclear and conventional. Will the Russians actually set off a small nuclear in a conventional confrontation somewhere with one of our allies? And the theory that they might do that is that they can hurry and use a small nuke to escalate it, to scare us off that they're really serious about this, and maybe get concessions that they wouldn't get otherwise. Does the president need more flexibility right now? Launching ICBM is a pretty harsh decision to make when there's something like that going on. Some people are arguing we need the stockpile to have lower yield weapons, less collateral damage weapons, and maybe special outputs. This is going back. People will argue that's nuclear warfighting, that's not nuclear deterrence. There's a thin line. To me, there's no difference. One is the mirror image of the other. Unless you threaten warfighting, you don't have a deterrent, in my mind. But, and we have been there. We did an amazing amount of transitioning our deterrent through the Cold War period, and we went through the period of tactical nuclear weapons with all those characteristics. So, and then there's always a question of, with all the defense that Russia is building, is our stockpile even still credible? So, for the major fundamental reason. Okay, let me copy it here. So we've got the role of nukes, I think, is a challenge. I think the appropriate stockpile is a challenge. The third challenge is to reestablish our nuclear deterrent appropriate to today's threats and robust to future challenges. You've heard about the peace dividend, the optimism, the euphoria after the Cold War, resulting in a moratorium that stopped our testing. That's a fundamental thing that we can't do. There's a bunch of other things that we have not been able to do because of the enthusiasm and momentum toward optimism, and that is we have not been able to engage in any kind of exploring new nuclear designs in the laboratory, doing research and development in clearly recognizable weapons technologies. The government has shied away from all of those activities. What our labs do now is really assure the stockpile, or try to assure the confidence in today's stockpile, and that stockpile is your father's 1980 Oldsmobile. And it's in great shape, probably, but it's still your 1980 stockpile that's out there. The scientists have become very talented analysts at looking at data from weapons they've taken apart. They've been doing lab experiments. To be quite honest with you, there are areas in our nuclear weapons weapons where the physicists understand the physics better than we did when we were testing them. The things we couldn't understand then, we figured a way to get around them. Now we have learned what some of those are. But nevertheless, right now, our weapons expertise is predominantly analyzing and assuring a stockpile. There is no innovative research, nuclear weapon technique challenges going on. If we compare that to our Cold War deterrent, which was a very effective deterrent. That deterrent prevailed, at least, whether it won the war, whether a bunch of corrupt Russians decided to capitalize and take over Russia and make it go bankrupt. Whatever happened, you can debate, and the war may never have ended, as Paul said. But nevertheless, that deterrent served the need we were expecting it to serve during that whole time. But it was a dramatically viable, responsive deterrent. In 25 to 30 year period, in the height of the Cold War, we went to high yield, from atomic bombs to high yield, two-stage thermonuclear warheads, to bomb cities. With further technology and precision guidance, we went to more moderate yield thermonuclear weapons to attack military targets, high value targets. Along the way, we developed flexible, survivable, low-yield shells for use in holding off a conventional army in Germany. We even threatened directed energy in the Strategic Defense Initiative at the end. The reality of that notwithstanding, it was part of the threat at the time and was there when Russia or the Soviet Union. So that's an incredibly innovative, active, visible, dynamic capability to direct in any direction we need as the threats of the future change. In these past 25 years, two things have happened. The production complex side of that deterrent has been essentially idle in the context of building and working with new materials, new designs, and new weapons. And at this point, that complex is seriously in need of recapitalization. It is ranging from aging to obsolete to gone. These are special facilities for dealing with plutonium and uranium. They're not easy to build. They're expensive to build. There's a plan, and we're working on this plan right now, and it is to rebuild it in that old configuration. But it's delay after delay and cost after cost, and I am not at all optimistic we'll ever see that production capability come back. The challenge that the nation is facing with respect to that is there's also a manufacturing revolution going on. 3D printing, additive, you guys have seen all of this stuff. You see how they build these new Teslas versus how they build another Ford truck. The question is, should we be building this new production facility in the style of the old technology, heavy cost, many delays, long time, or should we be building it in alignment with this revolution in manufacturing, which is very expensive, premature, risky technology, and we may not succeed? So those are the two choices I see the country has for rebuilding its production complex. But I think the production complex has to be a viable part of a strategic deterrent if we're going to keep going forward. The R&D complex itself has not been doing any design, as I've told you. I jump over this a little bit down to the end. So the question I've told you why I think the R&D complex has degraded. I've told you about the production complex degrading. One proposal that I've heard that I find rather interesting, and it can be done without violating the test ban moratorium. It will indeed excite ideologies about what we're doing with weapons, and it will be a tough thing to take forward. But I have heard the proposal that what we should try is more competitions like we did a few years ago for something called a robust replaceable warhead. That never came to fruition because it was seen as a new weapon, new capability, and politically it didn't fly. But that exercise stimulated the laboratories in a way that I haven't seen in many years, with innovation and new thinking, dynamic moving forward. I do believe we could reconstitute the R&D complex side of our weapons nuclear deterrent with things like competitions that would stimulate designing, building, certifying some prototype new design, involving the plants, involving the labs, involving the lab tests. I'm not advocating that we stop the test ban. This is not a call for resuming testing. It's not a call against reasonable arms reductions in the future. It's not to give up non-proliferation efforts. I think those are all positive. We should be going forward. But I think I am trying to give a call for speaking softly, but ensuring that we're carrying a big stick. And to me, that big stick is revitalizing, reestablishing, revitalizing our nuclear deterrent capabilities. Not only for nuclear weapons. If it's the 1916 version of this meeting, and we're trying to really move into the future, I think we have to take into consideration cyber threats on the command and control of our weapons. There's a revolution in sensors and computers that, to me, I would find not surprising at all to find a plethora of sensors under the ocean in space that render the ocean transparent. Sometime in the future, and our submarines are no longer outside. I mean, I can imagine all of this kind of stuff coming. let alone beginning to talk about the 20th century was the century of physics, the 21st century is being called the century of biology. We haven't even entered into that world of needing a deterrent of some force. That might not be our nuclear labs, but I think around the concept of a viable nuclear deterrent should be a viable scientific-based deterrent to stay us on the cutting edge, us second to none in addressing these challenges.
That's an awful lot to think about. Before we open up the question and answers, we'll have two folks walking around with microphones. I'd like to ask our speakers, based on everything that you've heard tonight, is there anything you want to challenge one another on, ask a question of, or perhaps emphasize a particular point that was brought out by the other presentations?
My sense is we ought to give the audience a chance.
Great. Well, do we have any questions? We'll have our folks come down with a microphone for those of you that are raising your hands.
Dr. Hecker, this is a question that yields to sleeping at night, okay? My thought on Korea was that they're kind of primitive, same kind of thing for terrorists. That's really hard to do this and expensive to do this and hard to get the material. And so when they get to the point where it's getting too serious and they're getting too close, that we will do something to stop it. Apparently, in my mind anyway, we've gotten beyond that point. Do you see anything that's going to happen in the near future to maybe change that outcome? Because it sounds like to me like they're getting too scarily close to at least for my comfort.
You are asking about North Korea, and how do you go from...
Same thing happened with terrorists. Same idea.
Oh, with the terrorists.
Well, terrorists and North Korea both correct. It seems to be unlikely that they would be as far as they are presenting very big, very more restrictions. I wonder, when do we stop them?
So with the terrorists, the issue with terrorists and nuclear weapons is that making the plutonium in reactors or making the high enrichment the enrichment process, I think everyone believes that's beyond the means of terrorists. So they can't be building a nuclear weapons program. We don't believe they're a terrorist organization. They're building a nuclear weapons program the way that North Korea would. Or maybe Syria would have if that reactor would be completed. So the concern with terrorists is not making that material. That's the good news they get. The bad news is they have to. In the world today, we're not sure exactly how much is there. There's well over 1 million kilograms of this material in the world. And it takes, let's say, 6 kilograms for plutonium and a few tens of kilograms for hydrogen uranium. So the issue is, one, is can the terrorists get their hands on the fissile materials from someplace? And actually, that's the main reason I've been to Russia 52 times, is because 1991-92, that was a big concern. Brian Lisbeth is here. He's worked Kazakhstan with me in various places for very similar things. Look at those places. And so the problem there is that is a really big problem. If the terrorists were able to get the fissile materials, could they build an improvised nuclear device? And I think we have to assume that yes, they could. And so keeping the fissile materials out of the hands of terrorists is very difficult. So as much as we don't like what the governments are doing with nuclear weapons, the really tough job, as far as I'm concerned, is to make sure these things don't get out of the hands of the governments into the hands of terrorists. If I can, many of you know my predecessor, Harold Agnew, actually all of our predecessors, Harold Agnew. When he was asked about nuclear terrorism, he said, look, people who say that it's easy for terrorists to build a bomb are wrong. Then in typical Harold style, he said, people who say it's impossible are dead wrong. So I don't know if I answered that question.
long time, and none of us have mentioned tonight their conventional armament capabilities. They are a hard case on that front, far more than they are. They have built a fortress nation. They've hired tunnel boring machines and have tunnels running everywhere with conventional warheads out of sight. That should there be an invasion, that is a hard target to know what to do, even if you were not trying to get it with nuclear. It's a hard case, and why they do it, I've never been able to come up with a good idea. But it's still there, and it's something we need to worry about because of their willingness to sell any technology. And that's one of the problems as nuclear knowledge arises around the world. Lots of economies, everything is for sale, no matter what it is. And that makes the proliferation problem almost out of control for us.
Another question here?
Yeah, hi, John Alexander. You bumped off very quickly about the Iran deal, 3 issues. One, just from the nuclear weapons perspective, and terrorism and all that, but what do you see the effectiveness of the deal is as far as we know? 2, what kind of timelines do we think that puts us on? You said it was pushed back, well, how much and whatnot. And 3, from a political perspective, what do you think the probability is that if they achieve a nuclear weapon that they'd be used?
Can I have 20 more minutes? I'm sure somewhere in my computer I have the Iran talk. Let me just try to be as brief as possible. So, I think one thing is clear that Iran had gotten, by following building sort of the option for the bomb, they had gotten very close by the time of this agreement. The general consensus is maybe within a few months of being able to enrich enough uranium for a bomb. And what the agreement does, the reason that I said at this point I think it's a good agreement in terms of nuclear situation, it moves that out to a year or so. Now, it does have timelines associated with it, gas, and 15-year timelines as to where some of the restrictions go away. The Iranians have still committed that they will never pursue nuclear weapons, so even with those timelines there. But could they then resume their path to the bomb? So that's possible. But in that 10 to 15 years where we're not quite sure how Iran is going to evolve, I'd rather see us watching them without them having nuclear weapons than with nuclear weapons. The main problem and difficulty with the deal, and I think that's also part of what you were asking, is that in order to get the deal, in other words, the deal worked because the U.S. had enough nations aligned with it and were able to apply sanctions in such a way that they really did bring Iran. But without Russia, without China, without the European Union, so forth, we wouldn't have done that.
We can't hear you when the mic goes out. Can you change it?
Sorry?
Thank you.
I'm blocking the mic, or can
Maybe
you not
they need
hear
a
me?
new one.
Is this one better?
Yes, great, thanks.
Okay, well, my friend Bob's done lots of good things for us. So just to make that point, the only way that the U.S. was able to get these other countries to work with it was to limit the nuclear deal to nuclear. It didn't even include missiles. If you think about that, I mean, that's a pretty big omission. And it didn't include sort of all of the other nasty things that Iran is doing around the neighborhood, from the Hezbollah to the Hamas to the Houthis to what they're doing in Syria and so forth. So the deal didn't fix those problems with the rest of what Iran is doing. And so in the end, we'll have to wait and see whether these 10 to 15 years with them having walked back from nuclear weapons, and I think they really have walked back, my opinion is they'll stay back. But that doesn't mean that Iran is going to be easy in that neighborhood. the upside is sort of that more than half the population of Iran is under 30. They have no use for the Ayatollahs. Will that country change? I don't know. And so that's part of the issue in Charleston. I'm not sure I've covered all of what you wanted, but hopefully sufficiently.
Bruce, you have a question?
Yeah, I have two questions. One for Sig. Yeah, that warhead that you showed us, my mind wanted to see 2 tritium bottles in that warhead. Am I close?
I'm sorry.
2 tritium bottles in the warhead.
Yeah. So for example, if it's to be a hydrogen bomb, or at least what we would think is a modern hydrogen bomb, a two-stage thermonuclear device, you would like to have seen 2 things in it. So, for example, it didn't look. The other reason, also, for the fact it wasn't a hydrogen bomb, from the seismic signal, you calculate a yield. And it was sort of 10 kilotons, plus or minus 4 or 5, not quite consistent. Could they have had some fusion component actually in there? That's certainly possible. But the thing that they showed, to me, is also not very convincing of being any sort of a good bomb.
So you think that warhead is mostly for show and not for real?
So I think they do a lot of things for show. You have to think about why in the world, if they're really out there to destroy us, why in the world would they show us all this stuff? So there's no question in many of the things that they announce through their KCNA, that those are things that they claim, probably more so than they have. Having said that, those nuclear tests, though, 3 out of 4 work. We're in the ballpark of 5 to 15 kilotons, and Hiroshima was 13 kilotons. That's a weapon that can destroy a city. So we have to take them seriously.
Well, I agree, and I came to a lot of the same conclusions you just talked about when I saw the evidence from that last test. Let me ask the second question. I'm not too concerned about terrorists getting their hands on a weapon per se. When I see the way the people of Japan reacted to the small levels of radioactivity that came out of Fukushima, and I had a lot of exposure and experience to the fear and paranoia that people not only in our region but around the world have with anything to do with radiation. I'm concerned that a terrorist can easily get their hands on any kind of radioactive material. It would even be better if it had a little bit of a plutonium signature. And if they could blow that up like they did in the airport in Brussels, it would send shock waves around the world that like we haven't understood before. It's this ability to terrorize us with the fear and paranoia that we already have in our society that concerns me even more than the actual nuclear explosion might.
Well, you just said most of it right there. So what you're talking about is, what in the popular lingo is called a dirty bomb, a radiological dispersal device.
Right.
For a dirty bomb, it would actually be quite a waste of plutonium or highly enriched uranium. You go with the various isotopes that are in radiotherapy machines, cobalt-60, cesium-137, industrial irradiators, and so forth. You wouldn't use plutonium or highly enriched.
And I'm not suggesting, I'm saying just enough plutonium that we could find it. And so we could find it. Just the fact that plutonium is present just puts another level of fear in people.
Again, I'm not so concerned about that. I'm much more concerned about the dirty bombs.
Me too.
Yeah, of course they would be concerned about plutonium, but from that standpoint, plutonium is easy compared to these other things. But having said that, let me answer the question of a dirty bomb. That's very different than, of course, than the Russian cloud, because in essence, we really cannot prevent terrorists from getting those materials.
That's right.
All over the world, there are more than 10 million radiation sources, some of them not well protected, some of them are orphaned. They're out there. The biggest question is, Why haven't the terrorists used a dirty bomb so far? If the effect is what you said, the effect will be quite a terrorizing effect. And so we don't know the answer to that. I think partial answer is most terrorists don't want that effect. That doesn't further their cause. But some may, and someday it's going to happen. And to me, what we ought to be doing is figure out how to avoid the second dirty bomb attack, so that we know how to handle the cleanup, the response, and not be terrorized, because that dirty bomb isn't going to kill a lot of people, but it'll terrorize them if we let them terrorize us. So we ought to be doing everything that we can not to be terrorized from these radioactive things.
Oh, I agree. It's called education, but we're not making a lot of progress in that regard.
Yeah.
We have a question in the back from the young lady. You can't say anything while you're handing the mic down.
Hi, my name is Samantha. I'm a psychology major at the University of Nevada, Reno, and my research is about de-radicalization of former extremists. I was wondering if the future of nuclear strategy, if in the future dismantling the ideology behind extremism will take precedence over the physical weapons. And if you could, if there's some way beyond my understanding that you'd be able to conceptualize something like that, if that makes sense.
I think the question is, does the ideology of extremism that is in the world today sort of override other factors associated with the concerns that we've been expressing?
I would just say that if I were trying to resolve that question, I'd be going to a professor in psychology quicker than I'd be going to a physicist.
I've said for years and years, if we're really going to make a major change, we've got to change the nature of man. And maybe that's where to put our things. Unfortunately, all the discussion about dirty bombs and so forth, my group at Sandia, which has been working terrorism, anti-terrorism for a long time, we worry more about the feelings that are out there to use whatever is there to terrorize and to kill people. And most of us all lost the most sleep over bioweapons, and this is unclassified. While I was ambassador, I got called into meetings because we had begun to realize that the Russians had large amounts of bioweapon material and that they had weaponized it and put it on missiles. And the answer, a lot of people, that there had been refrigerators in most of the silos that were very full of things, was indeed the case. And now that technology's leaked all over the Middle East and lots of other places. And your question about Japan, do you remember the Aum Shinrikyo? They had a poison gas, and they used it in the subway and killed a number of people. But what wasn't publicized, though it's unclassified and known well in Japan, is they had bought a sheep farm in Australia, and they had deployed these vaporizers as a test against the sheep on the farm. Total effectiveness to kill all the sheep. And so their leader said, oh, bring it into Tokyo because it's now ready. Well, thank God it was the winter time. And the things were about 20 degrees centigrade cooler when they deployed them, and they didn't work nearly as well, or the death would have been civilians in Japan. And so there, in your scheme of worrying nights, there's a lot more out there. And I would say to the people, we've got to worry. We don't have the luxury of worrying one against another. And so it's what is driving people to do this that might be a more fruitful direction than trying to plug every possibility.
May I just comment on that also? On that happy note. So my view is, I have somewhat different view than Paul does on bioweapons today. In fact, I don't like the term WMD, weapons of mass destruction. I think today are not weapons of mass destruction. Chemical are not weapons of mass destruction. You kill some number of people. Nuclear, the mushroom cloud is a weapon of mass destruction. It's instant, there's no analog. When you split that nucleus, you get a factor of millions. And so the reason I worry about nuclear is because it does have this potential of just changing things instantly. And so nuclear is still the one pole that sticks out. By the way, radiological are also not, the dirty bomb is not a weapon of mass destruction. It's a weapon of mass disruption. So those three things are not weapons of mass destruction. We need to worry about it. However, in the future, the bio world can come back to haunt us and perhaps be a real threat to humanity. And it's through the capabilities of what the world can do today, the gene editing, actually changing the whole genetic makeup of people. We have no idea yet as to how that's going to affect or how it's going to be used. That needs to be watched, and I think that's out there somewhere in the future. So I worry about that. And fortunately, this country has good scientific capabilities, but it's this incredible marriage of social, scientific, and security things. As far as the religious extremism or other extremism, I mean, those are things I worry about every day because they're happening every day. And quite frankly, I mean, the world's gone to hell. As you look at all of these places everywhere, there used to be so much hope, and I think the time will tell us that time is over. So I worry about it. I guess that, Jack, that's one way.
Hopefully that wasn't an EMP device. I have a question back there.
So, Ambassador Robinson, you implied that Russians have developed whole new classes of weapons. Presumably that's because we don't follow the same definition or understanding of what a nuclear test is. And while you did not call for the nuclear testing, do you at least call for adopting the same philosophy regarding the definition of what constitutes a nuclear test?
If I had been negotiating the CTBT, I would put a really verifiable limit. And unfortunately, that's not been achieved, and that's a problem. But I don't think it's a question of testing. I think we really have to worry about real capabilities in weapons. That's what kills in the end. And this thing that they worked on with a pure fusion weapon is something that there was a lot of interest when I first left graduate school, and also when I ran the weapons program at Los Alamos. We had a program that people felt something could be done. The biggest problem in our weapon program, and Sig put his finger on it, not only are we not working the stockpile in the right way, but we've prevented advanced concept thinking. It's illegal to have an advanced concept nuclear weapon research program today without getting the president's signature. That's not going to happen.
Well, we have one final question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Bradley, a freshman at Coronado High School. I have two questions. First is about the Iran deal. Is there a way that Iran can develop nuclear weapons without us being able to detect it. The second one is two questions, which is how capable are we if there was a nuclear war that started with, say, Russia? How well would we be able to shoot the nuclear weapons down? Do we have that capability yet? And would that cause a mushroom cloud, or would that simply disperse the radioactive material in a largely harmless way, or less damaging than a normal reaction?
Good question. I'll tackle the first and give the second one to my comments. On Iran, of course, you can never say something is totally impossible. But the deal makes it highly unlikely that Iran can actually go down the path without being, caught to a nuclear weapon. So we would indeed catch it. We would know when they break up. And what particularly was good about the deal is that the inspection protocol, the verification inspection protocol, is more stringent than anything that's ever been done anyplace. And besides that, Iran is also a much more wide-open country than is North Korea. So there are lots of things inside the country that will give you some idea. And then just to finish that, my own belief of why the deal was made, and I actually had a chance to meet with this foreign minister, Zarif, before they started all these negotiations. My belief is actually that right now Iran has figured out they're better off without a nuclear weapon than with a nuclear weapon. So they're actually giving it up because they actually don't want it right now. That having a nuclear weapon brings the United States and brings Israel in. Not having a nuclear weapon gives them much more ability to do the things they want to do in the neighborhood, which we object to, but we didn't do that in the deal.
Let's see, I'll move on to my opinion on the second. Your question is the hypothetical question that the Russians would launch against us a major nuclear
Or just
attack.
like anyone, how well would we be able to defend ourselves with anti-nuclear weaponry?
That gets into the whole credibility of deterrence and deterrent force and restrike capability and what we do or don't know about their air defenses and so forth. I think it would be safe to say there is no question if that hypothetical situation did occur and Russia did launch a massive nuclear attack against us, I think we would have a very massive, credible launch of nuclear weapons that could be sent back. And I don't know that you could measure win or loss or details that you might be looking for in that case. I think it really has to be, they have to believe we would do it and could do it, and so they won't. Once they do, I don't know there's a nice clean description of what the real is from that point on. That would be my take.
I already mentioned what President Reagan thought. If there is a nuclear war, there are no winners. And I think that would be the bottom line of the question.
And I think
Very
that's
sad situation in lots of places.
putting words in Sig's mouth. I think that may be a little bit behind Sig saying, I don't think we're going to have, we have too much in common interest, too much reasons not to do that to each other. Makes no sense.
Well, thank God that will never happen. Well, I'd like to have Nelson Cochran come up and do the closing for us tonight and thank our panelists.
There was a TV program many years ago, Outer Limits. People remember the closing remarks. We now return control of your TV to the user. I think that that's appropriate for this meeting. This has, I think, been very stimulating. These gentlemen obviously are very astute, have studied these matters, and I think they have given us some very good information to deal with. So on that note, I would like to ask you all to give them a round of applause. how we can round up people like this on a regular basis to come in and talk. It's gratifying to see this many people come out on a night to listen to these people on a very serious subject. As a tradition within the Historical Foundation, we have magnanimous gifts to give these gentlemen. One for you, Sid. One for them. Hey, I got one for Jack, too. You can trade this in for a different model if you want. Thank you all for coming. Please tell your friends and neighbors that that we have these lectures from time to time and of a serious nature like that. So with that, we are done. Thank you again, UNLV, for hosting this. Please be careful when you go home.